Well, a few months ago, I had to have this sleep study done. I don't know if you guys have ever had a sleep study done. Yeah, a lot of you, okay, a few of you guys waving at me. Okay, they're terrible, by the way, okay? It's such a bizarre thing because I guess my wife is saying I'm waking up dying in the middle of the night, like I'm gasping and all this stuff. You need to have a sleep study. So I'm like, okay, fine. And because apparently I'm not getting enough rest, okay? And so I go to get the sleep study done just a month or so ago, and it's such a weird thing because they call me up like, okay, it's at this business office. I'm like, oh, okay. Slumber party at a business office, weird, but okay, I'm in. And so I go to this business office, and I'm ready for it's 8 o'clock at night. And I got my Costco pillow, those big ones look like a couch that you carry with you. And because you need your pillow when you go to sleep. And so I show up at this building and there's nobody there. I mean, no cars there, nobody there. It's behind a 7-Eleven. I'm like, this is really weird. I feel like I'm being set up for something, you know what I mean? And so I'm walking around like almost in my PJs because I don't, but it looks like I'm ready to go night-night for sure. And finally, I'm walking around this building because the directions are, look for the doorbell. I'm like, look for the doorbell. Business office with a doorbell. Okay, fine. Couldn't find a doorbell to save my life. Then finally, some other gal got there, and she was definitely in her PJs, but no pillow. And I saw her. I'm like, are you here for the sleep study? She's like, oh, I am too. I'm like, oh, great. Have you seen a doorbell? She's like, I know where it's at. Come with me. I'm like, okay. And behind this bush is this doorbell. And so finally, they let us in. I'm like, of course, why would you want a doorbell to be seen by everybody? That's ridiculous. And so some people come out and they grab us and they take us back through the offices. And it's like, you go to a doctor's office. Usually there's like a table, a chair, something to lie on. This is all bedrooms. It's like 7 bedrooms. And the guy's like, you're in the last one, the 7th bedroom. I'm like, okay, really weird still. And there's a big bed there and I got my Costco, pillow, so I'm good to go. And the whole night, got these electrodes, all over your body, your chest, your face, kind of determining if you're, dying in the middle of the night or not. And, I don't think I slept the whole night, I'm in this weird place. I'm in this weird building. I'm in this weird bed. My wife's not there. The whole thing is just weird. At least I have my Costco pillow, though. But by the time morning came, which was 5 a.m., from 10 o'clock at night till 5 in the morning, I had zero rest. I'm absolutely sure of it. I don't remember closing my eyes. I was freaked out the whole time. I was scared somebody was going to come and take me. And I didn't rest at all. And I don't know how they could determine a whole sleep study from something that I've never slept. But apparently that's part of this gimmick, I think, trying to determine I don't sleep at all. But I think as a society, we're getting less and less rest in general. We have all these things to help us rest. We have different iPhones, iPads, different things at our house, smart devices to help us be more organized so we can have more time and hopefully have more time to rest. But do we? Do we have that time to rest? In the Old Testament, God set a whole day aside for the Israelites to rest. It was called the Shabbat in Hebrew, or Sabbath, we also are called here in English. But it was a whole day that was set. They did no work at all, and all they did was rest. I think now, more than ever, we need that day to come back almost, where we need to rest. We're such a busy society. We're such people that are just on the run, just go, 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 every day it seems. And when we get to reading the New Testament, we see more conflict with religious rulers when it comes to the Sabbath than any other issue when it comes to Jesus in the New Testament. Why is the Sabbath thing such a big deal? Why are they always up in arms about Jesus breaking the Sabbath? Over and over we see this. Let's take a look tonight, this Sabbath breaker, Jesus, in Matthew chapter 12. And is he really a Sabbath breaker or not? Matthew chapter 12, verse 1 is where we look tonight. And the title of our message is The Lord of the Sabbath. Matthew chapter 12. So this account of this breaking of the Shabbat or Sabbath is recorded in all 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All record this exact same event of breaking the Sabbath, so they think. And we've broken down our study into 2 parts. Now, the first part is going to be the Lord of the Sabbath, proclaimed, verses 1 through 8. And the second portion of our study is going to be the Lord of the Sabbath, displayed, verses 9 through 14. Let's look at verse 1 together. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Jeez. So Jesus and his disciples are going through the grain fields, and as they're going through the grain fields, these could be cornfields as well. The word's kind of the same in Greek. They're picking up these grains, and they're rubbing them together and blowing off the husks and kind of eating them as they go. And so probably on their way to synagogue, where they were going, is where they're going to end up for sure. And these disciples, they're hungry. And they're hungry. There's no place to stop along the way. So they're grabbing these ears of corn or these husks of wheat and eating them along the way. But notice this, that Jesus isn't one of those who's eating. The Pharisees' complaint are, your disciples. Your disciples are breaking the Sabbath. They weren't claiming that Jesus was. They're saying, hey, your disciples, they're breaking the Sabbath. Tell them to stop. See, breaking the Sabbath in their mind is that they're harvesting. As they're going through this field, the disciples are harvesting grain and they're working. And remember, on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to work. You're supposed to rest. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But the Pharisees thought that they were breaking the law of the Sabbath. But what is the Sabbath? What is the Shabbat? Where does it come from? Why is it such a big deal? Well, the word Shabbat in Hebrew, or Sabbath, it means rest. That's all it means. It means rest. And it started off with God in Genesis chapter 2, where God created all things in 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested, okay? And it wasn't like God was resting because he was tired. God's like, phew, man, that was a long 6 days. I'm so glad I have time for this. It's not rested in that sense as much as he looked over his creation, or he mused over his creation and said, what I've done is good. So he wasn't resting like he was tired, but it says that God is the one that rested. So man wasn't even involved at all in the first part of Shabbat. In the first initiation of Shabbat, man wasn't even part of the whole story. It was all about God, and God rested. It wasn't mentioned until Exodus chapter 16. Later on, we see that God was giving manna from heaven to the children of Israel as they're going through the wilderness for 40 years. And as they did so, God gave them, he told them, said, hey, listen, you can gather for 6 days. On the seventh day, this restriction is in place. So it started with God. It came in Exodus 16 as a restriction. As the manna came down, for 6 days they gathered. And God told them on the sixth day, you gather that manna enough, take twice as much for the Sabbath, because you can't gather on the Sabbath. If you do, it'll be stinky and it'll be full of worms. So don't do it. Of course, what did they do? They did, and it was smelly, and they said, this is wrong. But God gave them that restriction for that. But there was no commandment yet for the Shabbat, for the Sabbath. It wasn't until Exodus chapter 20, where one of the 10 commandments, God said, remember the Sabbath day and make it holy. It was our fourth commandment in the 2 tablets. So we see the Shabbat, the Sabbath, it started off with God, and really it wasn't given to man until later on, until Exodus chapter 20 in the 10 Commandments, where it's observed by man. But God gives this day to them by taking away that day. You know what I mean? He said, I'm going to give you this day by taking away everything in that day, that all you have to do is rest. All you have to do is look back at my creation. Look what I've done. So God was blessing man by giving him this Shabbat, this rest, this Sabbath day for them to relax and don't work, just hang out. Look what all that God has done. But look at Jesus' response to this supposed Sabbath breaking in verse 3. Now, but he said to them, he's talking to the Pharisees, and he said to them, have you not read when David did what he did, when he was hungry, and for those who were with him, how he entered into the house of God? Jeez. And there he ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, and more for those who were with him, but only for the priests. For have you not read in the law of the Sabbath of the priests in the temple, profane the Sabbath and are blameless? So Jesus gives them these two examples that they're not breaking the Sabbath law. He gives them a first example about David and his men. And David, when he was leaving from Saul, and after Saul tried to kill him, he said, okay, I'm leaving, took a few of the men with him, and he went to Ahimelech, and Ahimelech said, hey, you know what, you've come to the house of God, there is no food here. And they were starving, like, man, we're so hungry, we'll eat anything, that kind of feeling. Have you guys ever felt that way? David felt that way, and his men were like, man, we're starving to death, everything's extreme. And so Ahimelech said, we don't have anything here. Ahimelech said, we have nothing here except the showbread that's meant for God, and it's not meant for man. He's like, well, just give it to us. It's okay. And so Ahimelech gave it to David, and David ate with his men, ate there. So there was a reason. There's some allowances for the breaking of Shabbat, so to say. Then Jesus gives them a second example of the priests in their temple service. See, remember in those days, over 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was there in Jerusalem, and throughout the next earlier thousands of years also, the way that your sins were covered was the death of an animal. So the only person working on Shabbat was the priests. Everybody else had to rest, but the priests had to work. They had to slit the throat of the animal, and they had to put fire underneath the animal. They had to light the menorah, the candlestick abra that was there inside the tabernacle, then into the temple after that. So they had to work. They worked the whole time, but there was an allowance for them. So Jesus is showing these Pharisees that, listen, you know what? You're taking this and understanding the Shabbat wrongly. You don't understand that there are allowances, that they had distorted the original intent and the original purpose of the Shabbat, of the Sabbath. It was to rest. It wasn't to get so legalistic about these little things because you're having some grain along the way. Not a big deal. And see, after the children of Israel left Babylon, that's where the Mishnah and the Talmud, and that's where these other commentaries on the Old Testament law came into being. And that's where their Pharisees most likely came from too, is out from Babylon, because Pharisee means separate ones. And so they started off good because they wanted to be separate from the Babylonians. But from that's where they gave extra rules to the law. And they said, well, what is work? Work is when you do this. When you carry a load that's over such and such pounds. When you walk a distance that's over so and so miles. This is what work is. So they gave definitions and the minutia of the law. And from this Talmud law, that's where they understood this is how we come about by saying this is what's allowed and this is what's not allowed. But the Mishnah and the Talmud were not given by God. They weren't written by God. They weren't from God. They're written by man. But even today in Israel, there are those who observe Shabbat. And for us Gentiles, we don't really understand Shabbat or the Sabbath as well. But Sabbath started at sundown on Friday night. As soon as the sun went down, so if you're in Israel at that time, in the early days, thousands of years ago, they would blow a trumpet and say, prepare for Shabbat. So that first trumpet would let you know, start locking up the store, start packing some stuff up. And then the second blowing of the horn, the shofar, then they would say, okay, Shabbat has started, no more work. Everybody relax. And that's where they would go home and they would eat. All the food would be prepared for them and they would eat and it would be a glorious time. But it started at sundown and went all the way to the next day for sundown. Why, you ask? Such a good question. It's because in Genesis chapter 1, it says that on day 1, that evening and morning came, and it was day 1. And on day 2, it says an evening and morning came, and it was day 2. So for the Jews, even today, evening and morning is one day for them. So their day starts at sundown. Just like in Israel today, if you go to Israel today, Shabbat starts at sundown, and then it continues on. But they've found ways around it in Israel today, ways to get around this whole idea of work. In Israel today, when you go to hotels, because a lot of the Jews will go to hotels, a lot of the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox will come as well. And those who take the law literally, and they are the ones that you'll simply see them in black and white. They'll have a white shirt, black pants, black coat, with a black hat with little tassels or tizas from here, where they would play with their fingers or pull their hair from this point. But you can tell those are the ultra-Orthodox. But in those elevators, or in those hotels, they have what's called Shabbat elevators. Because you can't stay in a hotel and get to your room without causing work by causing you push the button. It causes spark, it causes the elevator to come. You've called the elevator, so you've caused work. So what their workaround is, which is pretty funny, they have what's called a Shabbat elevator. And so a Shabbat elevator, it opens at every floor and it stops at every floor. It opens up for 5 seconds, closes, you're either in or you're out, and it goes to the next floor. So it goes all the way up and it goes all the way down. So on Friday nights when we get into Israel, we get to some of the hotels, we always tell all the tourists, hey guys, don't get in the Shabbat elevator, because if you're up in room or floor 21, it's going to take you a long time to get there. But sure enough, after every time I tell them, oh look, there's an empty elevator. I'm like, don't do it. Oh, too late. And they're stopped on every floor. So in those hotels, they also have Shabbat lights as well, because you can't turn on a light, because that causes, again, that same spark. You're causing work. And so the lights are on all day, and they turn off at 10 o'clock at night. Whether you want them to or not, they turn off, because you're not causing it to go off and on. It does it by itself. So they have workarounds around this whole idea of Shabbat, even in Israel today. There's a street called Maria Sharon, and this street it's all ultra-Orthodox, and if you drive a car down there, or for some reason your bus gets lost or something, they'll throw rocks at you and everything, because you're causing combustion to come through their neighborhood. So you see, this whole idea of Shabbat, it's traveled from those thousands of years to now. And if you remember, in Jesus' time, he spent a lot of time at Mary and Martha's house, Lazarus' house, right? And that was the exact point of distance from the temple that you could travel without breaking the Sabbath. I don't know if you knew that. There in Bethany, that's the exact distance that they could go without breaking the Sabbath. So you could walk there to and fro without breaking the Sabbath. Because Jesus never broke the Sabbath in the original sense of what the Sabbath was created for. And he did, at some point, kind of lend to some of their Pharisees and some of the different little small ideas of what was interpreted from the Mishnah and the Talmud. But for the most part, Jesus understands what the Shabbat is all about. But notice in our story, Jesus wasn't eating the corn. He wasn't eating the wheat, just the disciples were. Jesus is defending them with these two examples. Then in verse 6, it goes on. Verse 6, it says, yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not have condemned the guiltless. Jesus is claiming to be better than the temple. This would have floored them by saying, you're better than the temple? How could you be better than the temple? The temple's magnificent. It's taken 40 years to build, and you're better than the temple? Better than the priest? Better than the sacrifice? Better than everything goes on in this temple? How can that be? So Jesus is saying, I am better than all of that. Jesus is going to take away the temple service, the temple sacrifice, and his life as that sacrifice. Soon, Jesus was going to take all of that away. Could you imagine? You're a Jew and you've been going to temple year after year after year, and week after week, and after a special festival, and after every month, and all of a sudden, this young rabbi comes on the scene and says, pretty soon, none of this is going to be needed anymore. Do you know how hard it would be to believe this young rabbi, this guy in his 30s? Here he is saying that, you know what, this is all for now. I know for thousands of years you guys have done this, but pretty soon, this will all be, it won't work. It won't take away your sins. It won't cover your sins. There won't be the way to get to God. You know how hard it would be to believe that? I mean, I think it'd be tough. But Jesus is showing them and telling them, hey, you know what? Someone is greater than the temple is here. And then he tells them the most important part, the heart of God. God desires mercy or love, not sacrifice. Don't look for a way to say, I'm sorry, instead and try to give sacrifice, but instead, look to be obedient, look to act in love instead, because God desires love, not sacrifice. So Jesus goes on in verse 8 and tells them that for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus is proclaiming that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He is essentially doing away with all the Judaic practices and rules and restrictions. He's taking away all of it. And it's pretty amazing because if you think about it, all the 10 Commandments made it to the New Testament in one form or another, except the 4th commandment, except the Shabbat, except the Sabbath day and keep it holy, remembering it. All the other ones came in because they're all moral laws. But the Shabbat, the Sabbath, wasn't a moral law. It was for them. But now Jesus is saying, I am that rest for you. I am the Lord of that rest. And he's taking away all of that. The only one 10 commandment that didn't make it in there was this Shabbat commandment to keep it holy. But many believe that we should keep Sabbath even today. Maybe you run into some people today and nowadays that say, hey, you guys aren't doing it right. You should be meeting on Saturday. You guys are doing it wrong, meeting on Sunday. That's... The Shabbat has been done away with. And those who do that are called Sabbatarians, if you're wondering. And a lot of the Seventh-day Adventists are that way. They'll say you have to worship on Saturday only. Sunday's the devil, don't do it. But that's their idea of it. So why do we meet on Sunday? That's a good question. And here's why we meet on Sunday. We meet on Sunday because Jesus rose on Sunday. That's the first day of the week. And it had no significance, by the way, until Jesus rose on it. Other than that, it was like, yeah, that's the first day of the week. Okay, so what? But when Jesus rose on that day, it made it significant. And then on Pentecost, in Acts chapter 2, guess what day it was when the Holy Spirit came and descended upon the disciples and they spoke in tongues? It was also that first day of the week. It was Sunday. And later on in Acts 20, Paul talks about when you take an offering and when you take it up for us on that day that you're meeting that first day of the week. So from the beginning of the resurrection of Jesus till now, all the believers have always met on Sunday, not just here in America, but all over the world. Even in Israel, the believers there meet on Sunday. And so we do the same. It's because early church met on Sunday, and so we meet on Sunday too. It was the birth of the church. And so we're still holding on to that. But some will say, hey, you shouldn't do it. You should be doing it on this day or that day. And I like what Paul says in Colossians 2:16. He says, so let no one judge you in food or drink, or regards to a festival, or a new moon, or Sabbath, which is a shadow of things to come. But the substance is Christ. So we've looked at the Lord of the Sabbath proclaimed in verses 1 through 8. Now let's look at the Lord of the Sabbath displayed in verses 9 through 14. 9 says this, now, when they had departed there, they went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. So they probably came straight away from these fields into the synagogue. It could have been in this day, it could have been another day. They came to the synagogue, and in Luke's account of the same exact story, it said that the Pharisees wanted to watch Jesus to see what he would do. They may have even brought this man in with a withered hand that he couldn't straighten out, and there was something wrong with it. And all the Pharisees, they sat back and they said, don't do it, Jesus. Don't you dare do it. Don't you heal on the Sabbath. And so, of course, when Jesus came in, and it also says in Luke's gospel that he knew what they were thinking. I know what you're thinking. But remember, Jesus just said that he was Lord of the Sabbath. So now he's going to show that he's able to display that he is Lord of the Sabbath as well. Verse 11. And he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Or how much of you value this man than a sheep? Therefore, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Wow, can you picture this scene? Jesus shows their lack of love and legalism on the Sabbath day. It was made for man. Wouldn't you help someone if you could on the Sabbath, Jesus says? Because Jesus knew their hearts, and he said to them, which is easier, to help someone out of a hole or to say to this man, stretch out your hand and make it whole? And that's what he does. He says, stretch out your hand and make it whole. And it becomes whole. Again, the Pharisee is thinking that he's breaking the Sabbath. But here he is in front of everybody, stretching out his hand. Maybe this guy, as he was brought in, thought, man, I wonder what they're going to make fun of me about. Or I wonder why they're bringing me in. And here he is. And Jesus tells him, stretch out your hand. He's able to stretch out his hand like never before. Going, man, he really does. He proves that this is his day. Jesus is proving that this day, it is his day. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. Then in verse 14, he goes on. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. This is the start of the religious rulers and leaders. The Pharisees wanted to kill Jesus because of this, because he broke the Shabbat, the Sabbath. This is why they started to want to kill him. He didn't fit the mold of the Messiah that they wanted him to. And so now they're deciding that we must kill him. And this is the beginning of it. And of course, it's going to end there at the cross of Christ where he dies. They crucify him all together. First, he proclaims he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Then he proves he's the Lord of the Sabbath by healing a withered hand. And remember, the Shabbat, our Sabbath, means rest. So Jesus is stating that he is our rest. He is our complete rest. So in Greek, this word Lord, it's kurios in Greek, and it means a master. So Jesus is saying essentially, I am the master of rest. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. Because it's his day, he can do whatever he wants on his day. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the one who gives that rest. He determines who gets that rest. Jesus is stating that he is and is completely that Sabbath rest. He is our rest, but do we rest in him? There are two questions that we need to answer for true rest if Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath of our lives. Number one, are we taking time to rest? Are we taking time to rest? We're so busy as people. We're running here, we're running there. I find myself doing the same thing. I had the day off on Tuesday. It was 4th of July, and I'm still flying as fast as I can to the gym. It's open all day, bro. You don't even have to, there's nothing happening after. Just take your time. But we're so used to going fast, that we don't take that time to rest. We need to take that time to rest. We have all these things to help us with our time, but do we have things that would help us to remind us of rest? Maybe we need to take our iPhones and say, hey, Siri, remind me to rest. Because maybe we need that reminder, so we do it. Our priorities are lopsided in many cases. We're out of balance when it comes to rest, that we don't have that part of our daily activity to rest, or part of our week to rest. Maybe it's just a low priority. It's just not high enough. How many times I've had people say, hey, how come God doesn't work like he did in the Old Testament? Or how come I never hear from God? A lot of times we're so busy, we don't slow down enough to hear from him. We're just going, that we don't give that time to rest. Jesus had that same proclamation to Martha when Martha was busy about serving and Mary was at the feet of Jesus, and Jesus told Martha, Martha, you're busy about so much. What's needful is to rest. This is do what Mary's doing, sit at his feet and to rest. Many of us are heavy laden with the weight of the world on our backs, it would seem. The cares of this world are overwhelming us, and we're so worried that we can't rest. But we need to find that place of rest. We need to take that time to rest. And I don't know what rest looks like for you. Maybe it's taking a walk. Maybe it's going to a park. Maybe it's going to the beach. I mean, I love going to the beach, and I wish we were closer to the beach. And I lived in South LA all my life, and I took for granted the beach was 5 minutes from my house, like every day, you know? But I know when I go to the beach, that's a place of rest for me. I can sit there and watch the waves come in, and I could it sets my soul at rest. But maybe it's something else for you. Maybe it's something that doesn't cause our mind and everything to keep running and going and going. You know, sometimes for me, it's just sitting in the backyard, just staring at the pool, or just maybe hanging in a donut in the pool and just resting, you know, that I have time to think about God. Do you have that time where you stop and you rest? You think about God, that you take that time aside and say, okay, this is devoted to God. This I'm going to rest. Well, it's important for us to do so. The second question we need to answer is, are we resting in Him? Are we resting in the Lord of the Sabbath? If you're still in Matthew chapter 12, which I hope you are, turn back one chapter to Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Matthew 11, 28 through 30. It says this, "Come to me, all you who are labor and have heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That's that same word, Shabbat. "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Here's our first steps to true rest. If we're going to have Jesus be the Lord of our rest, the Lord over that for us, the first thing we need to come to Him. That's that taking that time. We need to come to Him. Take that time to come to Him and nothing and nobody else. You know, this world tells us that we'll find rest in something else. Maybe it's drugs or alcohol or something like that says this will give you rest. But we know that those who have tasted and seen, that never gives us rest. You know, I was a drug dealer, criminal, crazy person for too long, and I never rested. I think if we all attested that we've had maybe a little shady background like that, I never felt at rest. I was always looking over my shoulder. I was always wondering what was going to happen next. There was no rest. True rest only comes in Jesus, but we have to come to Him. Come to Him. That's where that rest is, and He will give you rest. Notice that result. It says that He will give you true rest. And the second thing, as we come to Him, we need to do is take His yoke upon us. We need to take His yoke upon us. We're trading our yoke for His yoke. It's a great exchange for us, let me tell you. We take our burdens of heavy lead and problems and the cares and concerns of this world, and we trade that for Jesus' burden. We take this backpack full of heaviness, and Jesus gives us an empty back full of nothing. Just love, grace, goodness, and love, joy, peace. That's what He gives us. But we need to take that yoke from Him, and we give Him ours. This is the great exchange that we can do. So we come to Him, we take His yoke, and thirdly, we want to learn from Him. We want to learn from Him. You know, when I first got saved, after I came to Him, I wanted to learn about this Jesus who could take away my sins. I couldn't believe it because I'd spent all my life sinning, and now all of a sudden Jesus takes away my sins. I want to learn about Him. Do you want to learn about Him? Do you want to learn how Jesus can take away your sins? Because I did. I've been a pastor for 27 years now. I've been a Christian for almost 29. And man, I'm still learning how God can do that, how God wants to work in my life. I'm still learning who Jesus is. I'm still learning about His character, of who He is. But notice it says that part of who He is, that He's gentle, He's humble in heart. That's the humility, knowing there's nothing you can do, and that God is in control. We've given Him our burdens, we've given Him our problems, and now He's in control. But look at the result. It says there that you will find rest for your soul. Not might, you will. It feels like you've had all the worries and cares and concerns beyond your circumstances, then Jesus is not being the Lord of your rest. if you're still holding on to those burdens, it's something that you can't fake. Because true rest only comes from him. You may say, yes, I've given my burdens to him. Yes, I've given him all. But unless you turn around and find that your backpack is empty because you've given it to him, then you haven't truly given it to him. You'll know that you've really given all your burdens to him because you can rest. You can relax. Even though whatever's going on in your life, cancer, finances, relationships, all of that, once we give all of those to him, then he can give us rest. But if you don't find yourself resting, then you haven't really given it to him. Or you've taken it back. You said, yes, Jesus, here you go, and I'll take that back. Thank you. I'll hold that for you. Let me know when you need it back again. No, we need to give it to him and let go. Say, okay, God, here's your problems, because God's bought me with a price, and so because of that, all my problems are his problems, and so that burden, that's all for him. He gets to do with it whatever he likes with it. And so once you've given it to him, you know you can't fake it because you truly have that rest. Then Jesus really is the Lord of the Sabbath in your life because you have that rest. And that's what he wants to be. You know, Jesus took the Judaic system and everything throughout history when it came to worshiping God and took it to an end. He fulfilled it all. And now he says, I am now the Lord of the rest, the Lord of the Sabbath. And he can do whatever he wants with that. And the first thing he wants us to do is to come to him, to give that problem, those issues to him, and he wants to give us rest. You know when you've done it because you have that burden lifted. You know your faith is strengthened. We need to take that time to rest in the Lord. Before, in the Old Testament, you're to rest, take that day, and think about the Creator. But now in the New Testament, we're to take that time, take that rest, and think about our Redeemer. Creator before, yes, but now our Redeemer. Look what Jesus has done for us. Look how he's become that Lord of rest for us. So you notice the Shabbat rest, it started with God, and now it finishes with Jesus. It started with God in Genesis chapter 2, now it finishes with Jesus in Matthew chapter 12. It started with God, and it finished with Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. He is our true rest. He is the one that we can count on to lift those burdens from us. But only you know if you really have or not. And maybe you need to come to him. Maybe you're here tonight and you've never come to Jesus. Maybe you need to come to him. He's been tugging on your heartstrings saying, come, your burden's too heavy. Your yoke is too heavy. Come, I want to give you rest. And maybe that's who you are today and you need to do that. You need to take that step and say, okay, God, I need to give this to you. It's too much. It's weighing me down. I'm not going anywhere. I need your help. If that's the case, and we're going to spend some more time in worship, we're going to spend some time resting. And as the worship team comes forward, we're going to ask God to help us. Help us to find that rest and to find that place where we can just take that breath and say, okay, God. And as we do so during our time of extended worship, maybe give that heavy laden to him, to give that burden to him, to offer it to him because he wants it. Let's pray.